delighted to spend this morning speaking to Mark Cliffe, up until very recently the Chief Economist at ING Group and now head, as Emma said, of the New Horizons Hub. Mark is a native of Sheffield, but now manages a global team of analysts trying to make sense of the world, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And welcome to you, Mark.
Hi, good morning.
Brilliant. Good morning, good morning. So today, what we're going to do is, in contrast to some of the episodes that we've run before, we want to look long term. And really what we want to do is discuss the kind of world we want to live in versus the world we might get as society actually adapts to COVID-19. So it's a golden opportunity to ask an eminent analyst and economist about post-pandemic scenarios. So please do fill up that Q&A box and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So I'm going to turn to you now, Mark, and we'll get started because we've got quite a lot of ground to cover. First of all, you run the New Horizons Hub at ING Group. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and also a bit about pandonomics as well?
Okay, yes, thanks. Well, the New Horizons Hub is a spin out of our research operations. It's a small centre of expertise which is going to be doing research and thought leadership on a variety of very specific topics that are very important to ING, innovation and sustainability, but also consumer behaviour. So we're looking beyond, if you like, the near-term outlook for the economy and markets. That's the job of the research operation. What we're doing in the hub is looking at how people behave and make decisions. We now have the digital technology to offer personalized services in real time to our customers. So behavioral economics is a core activity of the hub. But of course, we're also faced with a lot of other disruptive changes in the economy, in politics, and in society. So the hub is going to be looking at these disruptive changes, coming up with thought leadership, and looking at how we can apply these to our business and to that of our clients. But I think one of the reasons why we've called it a hub is precisely because we're not just using our own expertise, we're trying to curate and facilitate interactions with external experts. So networking amongst experts is an important aspect of the hub as well. Now, as for pandonomics, I mean, I came up with the name because I thought it was a nice mashup of the words pandemonium, pandemic, and economics. The idea here is that we are faced with one of the biggest disruptions in our working lives. I mean, this is an amazing coincidence. We launched on March the 1st, and pretty much we were immediately thrown into looking into COVID-19. And so what we decided was we would look at the longer term implications of the pandemic. The point being that what you do through the pandemic could make or break you as an organization, but you have to have an idea of what kind of world we're going to be left with. So we've identified 15 shifts in this pandonomics article that we put out last month. And we're updating this as we go along. So, you know, we'll obviously be very interested to hear what the Nimbus 90 network thinks of all of this.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. So I wish we could cover all 50 shifts in the time that we have, but you and I are going to discuss just some of those points. Over the next kind of 10 to 12 minutes. Then we're going to actually take a little bit of a poll, hopefully, and sort of see what the audience think to what you're saying, and then we'll go into some questions. I think a question has already come through, so that's great. I think we're going to have a few for you. So let's turn now to try and get through pandonomics and as much of this long-term thinking as we can. First of all, I think a really important issue, a phrase that's been, I suppose, quite ubiquitous over the past few weeks is the new normal. Many commentators suggest there's going to be a new normal once the pandemic is over, if it even is. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly new, but it's not normal. I'd say it's much more useful to think in terms of an evolving new abnormal. It's like a rolling shock of the new, if you like. Uh, let's just think about this from the perspective of how the word normal is actually defined. If you look in the dictionary, what does it say? Regular, usual, healthy, bizarrely, natural, orderly, ordinary, rational. Do we really think that over the next year or so, even if we get a workable vaccine, that we can apply those words to the state of the world? I think it's pretty unlikely, because we're going through some unprecedented changes. We've gone through we're going through a very traumatic experience. We're re-evaluating our work, our lives, our social interactions, our behavior, our values. We're going to see some fairly deep economic scars as well, from unemployment and inequality, a lot of bankruptcy, a lot of debt. The role of the state has been transformed, and we're really questioning at a very deep level the competence not just of the government, but all kinds of institutions, and indeed the behavior of businesses. And in the midst of all of that, we're seeing an accelerated adoption of new technology. So all of these things, I think, are going to change the way that the world works. And I think it's pretty hard to be definitive about what normality will look like in that situation. Some of these things are going to be fairly binary. You know, are we going to see a move towards more populism, or are we going to see a reversion towards more globalization? So, you know, there are many big questions like that really make it hard to identify what normality will look like. So I think it's much more productive to think in terms of us being in a state of flux for several years from here.
And that's actually a very useful way to think, not least because it involves changing mindset. And you talk in Pandonomics about moving from a risk mindset to an uncertainty mindset. And what is that, and how do businesses adopt this new mindset?
Well, I think there's in economics, there's a basic distinction between risk and uncertainty. And risk is something that's quantifiable. It's like the risk that you take in playing on the roulette wheel in the casino, whereas uncertainty isn't quantifiable. A lot of things that are happening are unprecedented. So you can't use historical parallels. The data that you have isn't relevant because we're in a completely new situation. So therefore, you have to adopt a completely different mindset. You have to use your imagination, you have to use your intuition, you have to use deductive logic. And I think it's much more useful to think in terms of scenarios and contingency plans. What if such and such happened? What is the rule of thumb that we should use? It's in these kind of circumstances, it's much better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. You know, a lot of people in business are used to dealing with numbers and money, and there's an inherent precision around that. But you know, when you're faced with these kind of existential threats, you really have to be agile in the way that you're thinking about things. And a lot of this is really about thinking, what kind of a world are we actually in? If we're in a world of a pandemic, then we're looking at a situation of exponential change. Suddenly we go from nobody being infected to millions of people being infected in a matter of a few weeks. This is literally viral growth. Certain other things are step changes. These are not the sort of 2%, 3% per annum changes. You know, if Trump loses the election in November, that will be transformative for all sorts of things. So I think you need to be very wary of just extrapolating recent experience, and you have to develop, if you like, a culture of preparedness and responsiveness. So you have to have your contingency plans, you have to be diverse in your thinking, you need to be monitoring things. Good news here is that technology is increasingly giving us the capability to monitor things in real time. And I think you also need to be prepared to act fast. After all, that's one of the key lessons of the pandemic. You know, just a delay of a few days has unfortunately led to thousands of lives being lost. So I think you really do need to change the culture of the organization to deal with these kind of situations of uncertainty.
Thank you. You mentioned in your opening remarks globalization, and do you think that globalization is forever changed? I mean, has this trade-off between interdependence and sovereignty shifted?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly there's a lot of questions being asked of globalization. We saw at the outset with the disruption of finely tuned supply chains dependent on China that we perhaps have over-optimized our businesses, and I think that was an early learning, if you like, from the pandemic. But we've also seen, unfortunately, the rise of rather nationalistic response to this pandemic. Obviously, to some extent, that's understandable in that health is really the preserve of national governments. But on the other hand, we've seen some pretty selfish behavior amongst governments here in the midst of the pandemic. So there's a lot of things that have been broken in the process. And the absence of the traditional sort of US leadership in this global crisis, I think, has also been a great concern to everybody. Having said that, I think the pandemic is self-evidently a global threat, and I think all is not lost for global cooperation. As I mentioned, you know, we've seen the populists have somewhat seized upon this for their own advantage, but I think people are also keen on competent government as well, and certainly in the democratic world, we could see some governments paying the price for this, and I think over time there will be, if you like, a new form of globalization. I call it internationalization rather than globalization. We're not going to have, if you like, the finely integrated and deeply integrated vision that we were talking about a few years ago. I think it's going to be more a pragmatic cooperation on issues where it really matters, like health, for example. But I think there are other global threats like climate change where hopefully we'll see more cooperation in the future.
Yes, and absolutely. And I think not on a government level, but on an institutional level or an enterprise level, there's certainly been some interesting examples of collaboration and cooperation that perhaps we wouldn't have envisaged before this kind of threat. So one can remain hopeful on that front. Thinking about something else that's happened and that you mentioned with respect to technology, do you think we're witnessing a lasting switch from physical interaction to digital?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think a lot of people have made the remark already that we've seen an acceleration of the digitalization that we're anticipating over the next few years. We've all been forced into using the technology to interact, to communicate, to work, to shop. Of course, we miss social interaction, and touch wood, we will get the vaccine within the next year or two. But I think we've also learned that the technology is extremely powerful, and you know, you see the message in the financial markets. The tech companies have done extremely well out of this, massively outperformed. They have a lot of firepower to invest in R&D. So I think we're going to see a rapid acceleration here in the digitalization of activities. And even in my own industry of banking, we've seen obviously a lot of people forced into digital banking. And I think people see the advantages of this in speed and convenience. So I think this is something of a game changer. And I think it's also important in terms of sustainability, because looking at the idea of building back better, as it's called, I think digital technology is also potentially a very green technology. So I think there's a good combination there that will stand us in good stead when we get into recovery mode.
Absolutely. And I think we probably don't have time to discuss this between you and I, but I wonder whether there will be some questions from the audience about, I guess, some of the consequences of an even more technologized society, thinking about some of the data, some of the privacy aspects, and the surveillance aspects, which is a point in pandonomics about acceptance of that. So some really interesting issues there. I'm going to move on to just one last question from me, and then we're going to run hopefully a quick poll that the audience members can participate in, and then we'll be opening up to Q&A. And as I said, a question that came through within a couple of minutes, which is fantastic. I think now that we've had a bit of a chance to discuss, hopefully there'll be some more thoughts or comments from the audience on some of these really major issues, I think, that we're trying to tackle. So, I mean, in order to survive or hopefully flourish in the longer term, what do you think we really need to let go of? It's this opportunity for change. So what should we let go of?
Well, I think the first thing to let go of, to go back to where we started, is to let go of the idea that there's going to be a return to normality. I don't think that's the right mindset. I think, yes, let's not say that none of the old ways will return. Of course they will. We are social animals, so we will want to interact with one another. But, many things will be changed by this in ways which will, potentially be extremely unpredictable. So we have to get away from short-term sort of linear thinking. I think industry or business in general, I think, is going to have to tune into the idea of stakeholder capitalism in a real sense now. There was a lot of big companies who were talking about this last year and also at Davos, but this is for real now. I think this isn't just about the environment. This is also about the social dimension of stakeholder capitalism. There's going to be a lot of people who have been harmed by the pandemic, physically and mentally, but certainly economically. So I think the duty of care to our customers is going to be so much higher, and the scrutiny that business is going to be exposed to will be much more unforgiving, I would say. And I think the interaction between business and government is going to be sort of fundamentally change. So I think engaging with governments at all levels, local as well as national, will be extremely important for the success of business in the future.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. As I said, we've covered an awful lot of ground. There's so much more to talk about. There's an awful lot more in pandonomics, but what we're going to do now is try and run a quick poll, because hopefully everybody will have some thoughts on what we've talked about. But so just to kind of take the temperature, what we want to ask is thinking about your business, if everyone can think about their business by the end of next year. So we are going long term. That's the nature of the subject today. Thinking about your business by the end of next year, do you see major opportunities, minor opportunities, a return to normal, a word that we've discussed in detail this morning, minor threats or major threats? So please do vote now, and what we'll do, we'll take some questions, and then we'll come and we'll reveal the results in just a few minutes, and we can talk about those as well. Fantastic. So the poll is on the screen, so just click. It's just a quick poll. So I'm going to move to some questions now, and we had one, as I said, we had one sort of come through from Andrew that I really want to ask, because it's a research question, and I think that's excellent. So Andrew says, Mark, congratulations with the new role, first of all. And what was the most unexpected result of COVID-19 that surprised you, and now you would like to research more?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's essentially that people in our organization really started to tune into the idea that we do need to think about the situation differently, that the methods that we had for risk management, I think, are now very much under scrutiny, and that we do need to invest more time thinking about how the outside world is operating, because you get into this groove of year-to-year planning, particularly in big organizations, when this year is just a slightly different version of last year, and this has been a radical call to action, I think, for the organization. And I think it's really been impressive in the way that people have responded in business in general, not just in my company. I think you've seen some pretty amazing changes where people have cut through a lot of bureaucracy, started to use technology much more creatively. So I think that's all been very impressive and encouraging, I think, for the future.
There's a question from Jyoti Banerjee that's just come through, which I think is really what a lot of people are actually thinking, and you have certainly addressed to some extent in what we've discussed. But we hear the phrase "build back better" being bandied around, but to deal with the crisis we face, climate, biodiversity loss, raging inequality, we need to scale back the most egregious examples of resource consumption. I think a lot of people feel that, and it's an uncomfortable truth. Will that also impact our understanding of how the economy should work?
Yeah, it's a great question, this, and I think we have essentially a window of opportunity here to do something about this, because at some point there will be a reckoning. Obviously, there's a political reckoning, but there's an economic and a financial one. In other words, this is going to have to be paid for somehow. And I think it's pretty hard to imagine that the governments are going to be able to raise much more revenue from taxing labour. So I think there's going to be a fairly radical move towards the taxing of resources. So there's a lot of talk about, for example, carbon pricing and carbon taxation, but I think resources in general should be taxed. So this is a classic economist answer to the issue, which is to use the price mechanism. But I think on top of that, I think there's going to be a much more determined effort to change the regulatory environment against excessive use of resources. And of course, some companies are going to struggle with that if they're in the, if you like, the so-called brown industries. But the good news here is that we have a good rationale for government-led action, and I'm stressing government-led. It's not just about public investment, it's about catalyzing private investment to restructure the economy. This is what's really meant, I think, ultimately by Build Back Better. It's not just about getting any old job, any old brown job in particular, but really trying to use this as an opportunity to restructure the economy in a more sustainable fashion.
Yes, and actually, that kind of brings on to a point about leadership, and a question has come through on that, because what kind of leadership do we need? Some brave decisions, some bold decisions need to be taken, and where are those leaders? I mean, this audience member feels that the US and the UK seem to be bereft of that at the moment, and again, there's some major concerns on that front. What's a way that we should think about the leadership crises we kind of see evolving?
Well, after all, generally speaking, we live in societies where it's one person, one vote. So yes, it'd be great if we had better political leadership, and we watch nervously towards the US, I think, in particular this year. But I think we also have to look in the mirror. I mean, I think in terms of leadership, certainly in business, we have to step up and be braver. I mean, I think you saw elements of that in some of the recent gatherings like Davos, but there are, I think, growing signs that the business community is trying to step up as part of a more bottom-up effort to mobilize people behind change. I mean, think even in the US, the states and the businesses have been very much the prime movers in terms of trying to address the challenges of climate change, but this really has to now be accelerated and become more assertive. So you need a sort of, if you effectively a sort of a combination of government action, business action, and civil society. So this is, I think, in a truest sense, the vision of stakeholder capitalism that we should be trying to move towards.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask a quick question on a point around technology and surveillance. And once we've done that, it'll be time to go to the poll results and have a discussion of those. But do you feel that the old objections to kind of mass surveillance, which I think were a real driver of the techlash that occurred, really, are those old objections largely irrelevant now?
I don't think they're completely irrelevant, but I think obviously faced with a mortal threat like a pandemic, people are prepared to give up quite a lot of privacy. And I think there are ways of reconciling these things. These things aren't mutually exclusive. So, for example, the tracing app that Apple and Google are sort of working on using Bluetooth technology is a good example of an attempt to do things in a way which doesn't jeopardize privacy. I mean, it's not exactly foolproof, but I think there are things that people are looking at here in the tech area that could help. I mean, distributed ledger technology is another opportunity to protect people's identity and privacy in a way which is very decentralized and secure. So I think there are ways of dealing with this. But I think also people are, fundamentally reevaluating where the value is in their personal data, and to an extent they're prepared, I think perhaps more than in the past, to trade some of their privacy in this for the sake not just of the common good but their own good, because of course these things are also useful in your own personal decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually a question's just come through now which relates to this, because on an earlier breakfast seminar, Phil Scully, the CIO of Costa, talked about having to give people decision rights, that could be over data, and actually that could extend to other areas. And whilst this has tensions for regulatory regimes, I mean, do you think it's possible or desirable, or is this just an extension of all of us as these entrepreneurial market actors, that is kind of what's the current, that's really the current dynamic? What do you think about decision rights over things like data?
I think it's a tricky one, because a lot of people don't want to be bothered to think about this kind of thing. I mean, if you've got micro bits of data, you don't want to have to be, filling in online forms to give privacy for this, that, and the other piece of data. I think what you need is sort of generic rules of thumb, if you like, and also to essentially release information in a very selective way, so that only the bare minimum of information is released for the purpose that is intended. So I think there are ways of doing this that mean that you don't have to expose all of your data to everybody. I think there's room for a lot of creativity there.
So one quick question, the pandonomics, I think people would love to see that, and if that's all right, we can share a link of that and point people to the PDF, because I think that would be a really useful resource. So I'm actually just going to do that now, and we can also follow up with people. But what would be fantastic is to look at how optimistic people are feeling this morning and what they think is on the cards in the longer term for their businesses. So Caitlin, I don't know if you can reveal the results of the poll, or we can just sort of see what people are thinking. Wow. So yeah, Mark, what do you make of those results?
Well, that's great. I mean, I'm not sure whether I did a sort of a hatchet job on the word normal there, because that was one of the least popular options there. But it's an optimistic crowd, so I hope you're all right.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting sort of view, considering where we are, were we to run this in a few weeks' time, I don't know whether we would see some shifts there. And I certainly think if we were to run it in sort of 6 months' time, I think that's perhaps something that we need to do to sort of keep taking the temperature of the audience here, and with respect to how they see things evolving. But that's great. But so far, it looks like major opportunities. Mark, I want to say that we've, as I said, we've covered a lot of ground. I think Pandonomics is a fantastic resource, and I would really encourage everybody to kind of have a look at that. I've shared the link with people to do so. It's been really fantastic to have you here, and extremely insightful. And I think for, you know, for everybody, I'm just sort of checking if there's any last questions. We've got some great feedback to say. I think never waste a good crisis, which is one comment from Andrew there, which I think is true. I think what you've given people is very pragmatic ways to move forward. And Mark, whether I can ask this of an economist, how do you feel if you'd have voted? Would you be putting major opportunities? Can I ask that?
I would have probably said minor opportunities myself, but yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there are some major changes that come through the use of technology, which I think are just waiting to be grasped. Because the great news about this, which is particularly pertinent right now, is a lot of the technologies also bring massive cost savings. Because one thing we know is business is going to be under pressure. There's going to be a lot of cost cutting. Of course, there's a societal problem that arises from that, which is that a lot of the time when we're talking costs, we're actually talking people's jobs. And you know, that's where obviously we do need the government to be creative in terms of shifting policy to be supportive of job creation and innovation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on that note, that's a good way to end, and sort of remind us that certainly the months ahead are going to be full of challenges. Mark, I want to thank you enormously. It's been fantastic to talk to you on some of these major issues, and I think addressing some of the things that people really want to talk about and have some more in-depth conversations. So thank you very much to you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to hand back over to Emma now. To close and to wrap up. Thanks very much, Mark.
Pleasure, thank you.
And just to echo what Jess has just said, I think we've been incredibly lucky, Mark, first to have met you many years ago through an event we did called Converge, and for all of your support over those years. Thank you very much. I think the angle and the insights and the huge amount of knowledge you have really adds enormous value to us as a community. So thank you very much. I'll very much look forward to reading Pandonomics. The social and economics historian in me will enjoy that very much. And I think those unprecedented times create many new ways of living, working, bringing communities together, and so on. So thank you.